Okay, model dimensions. This is one of those areas of model scoping where you cannot think explicitly enough. And again, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here, people will think, well, that's obvious. And it is obvious, but the crucial thing is to actually be aware of how obvious it is and to think more explicitly about the number of dimensions you're dealing with in a model, because it does have a fairly significant impact on usability, layout, performance, and user interface. Now, to relate this back to fundamentals, when you include worksheets, Excel is a three-dimensional space. Realistically, in terms of user interface, you can only see one worksheet at a time, so we'll assume for this conversation that Excel is just a two-dimensional space. There are rows and there are columns. Now, with this two-dimensional space, it becomes incredibly hard to show multiple dimensions clearly. You can do this with things like pivot tables, but from a user interface perspective, it gets quite hard as the number of dimensions increases. Now, the reason why it's important to be very explicit with your thinking around dimensions when scoping a model is because there's obviously a compounding effect of adding dimensions. So for example, if I have a model that's got 5 products, that's 5 rows worth of information. I then add in 8 regions, all of a sudden I'm up to 40 rows of information. Next up, I add customer types, I might add currency. Every time I add a new dimension, that's going to have a compounding impact on, the number of rows I'm going to be looking at, and against that, the number of data points any one row is positioned in. Now, the other thing also to be aware of is that we obviously have time to be handled, and time is typically going to be treated on a column basis, but obviously you can treat things on a row by row basis. The important point is that time is typically going to take out one of your dimensions already from a layout and appearances perspective. So again, just a very obvious subject, but what I would do is whenever you are scoping up a model, always have in the back of your mind, how many dimensions are we talking about? What's the multiplicative effect of including all those dimensions? Now, one area just to touch on is that of flattening dimensions. So to a certain extent, you might actually be able to still handle products and regions by creating something like almost a hyphenated product region option. Now, it's probably worth just touching base on how Modano kind of interacts with this concept of dimensions. So as mentioned, from a native Excel perspective, you've got rows, you've got columns, you've got worksheets, and you've also got workbooks as a structural option around your number of dimensions. By comparison, Modano has a much deeper object library. And what that allows us to do is to tackle dimensions structurally on a much more consistent and more logical kind of basis. So within a Modano workbook, you've still got your columns, which for us is typically categories. You've got sections you can deal with. Modules have components. The modules themselves provide another dimension. Within that, you've also got workbook areas, and obviously you've got module areas, workbooks, and then up into a project. So whilst this doesn't necessarily get you over the problem of Excel itself being fundamentally a two-dimensional space, it does give you the ability to lay out and organize your information to handle those intermediate dimensions much more readily. And that's really one of the sales points of the Modano system. It's the ability to actually take a problem space and organize it in a much more convenient and structured and kind of more scalable manner.